Welcome, everybody. I'm Chaya. If you didn't hear this, I've been having some glitches with my computer, so I'm going to just be a disembodied voice today. But welcome to the third installment of The Sound of Silence with Ms. Miriam Gedwiser. I think we can jump pretty much right in because most of you have been here before, but again, I'll be promoting people to panelists. Please, we'd love to see your faces and see your hands and hear your questions, but please stay muted when you're not speaking, and I'll be putting the source sheet in the chat momentarily. I think that's all the housekeeping. Ms. Gedwiser, over to you.
Thank you, Chaya. Sorry. Hello. So welcome back. Thanks for coming back. Today I wanted maybe a little more open-lighted. I just saw the word spotlighted, so I said open-lighted, but what I meant is open-ended. Just like a little open-ended discovery, exploration of a biblical passage, which maybe we will read together, which is how I started the source sheet. So, yeah, I think that's where we are. We're going to begin in Vayikra, which is sort of one of the things I was thinking about when I created the concept of this class. And then, I don't know, it was one of those things like, oh, I'm sure there's something there, and we will discover what there is there. Here we are. So I'll share, even though you can obviously also share with yourself. I'll make it bigger. Is that, people see? Yeah. Okay. So we're in Vayikra. We're in one of the famous narratives in Vayikra, meaning there are a small number of narratives in Vayikra, and this is one of them. This is probably the biggest one that's as it relates to the structure of the book. And here we have it. So after after sort of the part of the beginning of Vayikra is about what, how korbanot work, whatever. There's this big consecration of the Mishkan in the previous chapter. I'm going to actually just skip for a second to the end of the previous parak in Vayikra. It starts with Vayihi bayom hashmini, right? There's 7 days of sort of preparation, and on the 8th day, meaning the 8th is sort of like the completion. On the 8th day, when we've been through a whole cycle of getting ready, we're going to finally inaugurate the Mishkan. There's a very precise set of korbanot that occur, and at the end of the parak, it's successful, right? We'll see what this has to do with silence shortly, though maybe some of you know. So then Moshe and Aharon came to the Ohel Moed, and then they came out and they blessed the people. And the goal of the Mishkan seems to be to interact with God. And in fact, Vayera kivod Hashem el kol ha'am, God's glory, whatever that is, appeared to all of the people. And then Vatetze eish milifnei Hashem vatochal al hamizbeach, and then this miraculous fire comes down and eats the korban that they have offered, and everybody shouts and falls down on their face. Vayaronu. Shouted is fine, I think, for us. So first of all, just like that's a noisy moment. It's a little, I don't know how we would describe that. Open to suggestions. So it sounds a little sort of chaotic, intense, overwhelming. You could use a lot of verbs. And everybody falls on their face. And then we move to our story, which is like this. So Aharon, I'll read in Hebrew and you can follow in English. The pasuk numbers got lost. Don't really know how in the copy pasting. I had some copy pasting problems, so we'll see if there's a problem. I will blame technology, even though I'm sure I had a hand. So I'm going to be in this sort of paragraph and we'll end here. So Aharon, right after this moment where sort of Moshe and Aharon enter the Mishkan and God's glory is revealed, and then this fire comes out and everybody falls on their faces. Nahada of Navihu, first of all, they're not on their faces, but they're motivated to do the following. They take their fire pans, they put fire, and they place incense on it. And they bring before God some strange fire that God had not commanded, right? So it's presented as them doing something wrong. And the fire, they offer the fire to God, but actually the fire comes out from God and eats them, consumes them, you could say, and they die. Milifnei Hashem is sort of a constant refrain in this chapter. Everything is happening before God. Okay, well, that's kind of a changes the mood, let's say, of our situation, where what was celebratory becomes not. Okay, feel free to jump in if you have something to say. So they die, and now we're left with our sort of original heroes, Moshe and Aaron, the ones who went in, the ones who brought God's glory down, whatever that means. They have an interaction that goes like this. Moshe el Aharon. Moshe said to Aharon, Hu asher diber Hashem lemor. This is what God said, Bikrovai akadesh al panei kol ha'am ekaved. I will be sanctified through those that are near me, and before all of the people I will have glory. Vayidom Aharon, and Aharon vayidom, which is translated here as was silent. I think that's how it's usually translated, but maybe we'll get into a little bit of the nuances. And that's how this topic comes to be our concluding topic, where Moshe says something. How do we characterize what Moshe says? Or I could ask differently, what's missing from this text? They die, and Moshe says, this is what God said, cryptic statement. And Aaron says nothing.
It doesn't address his loss at all.
Right. What's happening with Aaron before this statement? What is this statement responding to? Is Moshe just making an academic claim? Oh, that's so interesting. God had previously said this thing to me, and now I know what it is, which we'll see something like that actually in some of the commentaries. Is this responding to Aaron's grief in any way? Is Aaron experiencing grief? Like, it's not so clear. Like, there seems to be, the text itself seems to have a little bit of a gap. I don't know if that's kind of what you were thinking, but right, there's a loss, there's a personal loss here. There's something emotional that's not really reflected in this exchange, except possibly for Aaron's silence, right? Why is Aaron silent? Aaron, I don't know what we want to call it. I don't know. So we'll see a few possible readings of that. And then maybe we'll summarize. I wanted to read through the whole chapter because I think the question of what Aharon does and doesn't say, and how it's framed also by later commentators, is that's kind of the question. So then Moshe calls Elzaphan and Uzan and Mishael to carry the uncle of Aaron. He says, come forward and carry your kinsmen away from the front of the sanctuary to a place outside the camp. And they carried them out by their tunics, as Moses said. Okay. And now Moshe keeps talking, right? An interesting thing is that, right, all the speeches are done by Moshe. And he says something to Aharon, then he says to these other people, then he turns back to Aharon, but there's no dialogue. And in fact, there's a lack of dialogue when Aharon is silent. Then Vayomer Moshe el Aharon Ulazar Itamar Banav. Right, he says to them, Roshechem al tifrau, do not bare your heads. It's not clear exactly what that means. V'decham lo tifromo, don't rend your clothes. Lo tamutu, lest so that you don't die. Ba'al kol ha'dai yiktov, and furthermore, if you do something wrong, maybe God will get angry at the whole nation. V'achechem kol beit Yisrael yivku et hasrifa asher saraf Hashem. Everybody else will cry over this burning that God has burned. Okay. And you guys, you should not even leave the entrance of the tent of meeting, pentamutu, lest you die, because you have a special status. You've been anointed with God's oil, and they do what Moshe says. And again, they don't say anything. So again, I think as I didn't hear who said it actually before. Right, could Aaron be devastated? To me, that's the pshat, right? That he has nothing to say, because what is there to say? And maybe he's not going to, for example, push back against what Moshe just said, but maybe what Moshe said is also not very helpful. So, right, and here again, Moshe is sort of giving legalistic, almost instructions. He's basically telling them, like, I know that you think that you just lost your son or brother, but actually, you can't do anything about it, right? Don't do the normal morning things. And this pasuk is actually a source of hilkhot for avelut. The things that they're told not to do, we assume that other people are supposed to do. So you shouldn't do any of that stuff, because you're special and everyone else will take care of the crying in the morning, which is not always how feelings work, that somebody else can do them for you. But that seems to be part of having this public position. Okay. Vayidaber Hashem al Aharon, and then God says to Aharon. So Moshe is speaking to Aaron, is speaking to the cousins, now he's speaking back. He speaks back to Aaron and his sons. Now God speaks to Aharon, and he says, Yain v'shechar al teisht. Don't drink any wine or intoxicant. A nice translation, I guess. You or your sons, right? And you won't, so that you won't die. The third time he says, don't do this so that you won't die, and this is forever. Lavdil ben hakodesh ben hachol ben tamei ben tahor, right? And this is sort of in order to separate between the holy and the mundane, between the pure and the impure and the pure, harot b'nei Israel, and to teach the children of Israel, to teach them all the laws. What is lihavdil, to separate or to teach? How does that relate to the previous thing of not drinking wine? This becomes a source for a law that you're not supposed to render halachic decisions while drunk. It may become a source for a law that the Kohanim are not supposed to enter. It becomes a source for not a law, but a narrative explanation that what the sons of Aharon did was that they were drunk, and that's why they got punished, the ones who, the Nadav and Avihu. So the juxtaposition of this, the placement of this section here is suggestive. It's suggestive of a few things, some of which we'll see. So we have, right, this horrible thing happens. We don't really get any emotional reaction. We get Moshe giving Aaron this sort of explanation of, I will be sanctified through those who are close to me, which seems that the people, those who are close to me, is Aharon or his family, right? And it seems like it's saying this death was not as bad as you think. I think that's probably the pshat. There's some way in which it's trying to either justify or ameliorate the feelings by saying, oh, like that means they're close to God, don't worry. And then we get this instruction about not coming drunk. And now Moshe comes back with more instruction. I think it's really striking, like Aaron and his children are just like the passive recipients of all these to-do lists. So he says, he speaks to Aaron and his remaining sons. This is me. You guys can see that that's blue. I'm just making the paragraph on blue in English if you want to follow along. Right? Take the rest of the meal offering, and you should eat it as unleavened bread next to the mizbeach, right? It has the status of kodesh kodeshim, so you have to eat it in a particular place. He says, right, you have to eat it because that's your section that you're supposed to eat. That's what I've been told. The chazet nufa, right, the breast or the elevation offering, the thigh of gift offering, you and your sons and daughters may eat in any clean place. So like the mincha, the meal offering, you have to eat by in the mishkan, but other things you can bring home, you can eat with your family. This is a general rule. You have to sort of wave them and then you can eat them. Okay, so Moshe it almost feels like Moshe moved on, right? He's giving them general rules about how they should consume stuff. Like, oh, our ritual for inaugurating the temple has been interrupted, but let me remind you of what you're supposed to be doing. Meaning, I told you you're not supposed to mourn. We're going to take care of the mourning. Now you do your thing. And now we're going to inquire about some actual things. Moses, the goat of the sin offering, Darosh Darash Moshe, Moshe inquired, V'hinei saraf, and it had been burned. Like Sof al Elazar v'ali Tamar b'nei Harav ha'rotarim. They were, and Moshe got angry at the remaining sons of Aaron. He said, "Madua lo achaltem et chatat b'makom hakodesh." Why didn't you eat it in the holy place? He kodesh kodeshim, right? Like the mincha that I was just telling you about, it should have been eaten there. It should not have been disposed of by burning. Right? You're supposed to be carrying the sin of the people through eating that. Right? By burning it, you've sort of broken the expiatory process, you could say. It's not going to work. Right? Right? You didn't even bring its blood inside. Right? You must eat it inside as I commanded, which is right. You can't eat this one anymore, obviously, because it's been burned, but maybe he's saying next time. So he's sort of upset that they didn't follow protocol. And this is the first thing Aharon has said this whole chapter. Right? See, this day they brought their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord. Right? Such things have befallen me. If I ate a sin offering today, would the Lord have approved? Moshe heard and he thought, that's right. So I'm wondering what people think, specifically on the axis or the angle of who says what and doesn't say what to whom. And or what can we make of Aaron's initial silence to Moshe's sort of attempted explanation of this actual event versus Aaron finally speaks up about this seemingly secondary issue of should you eat sacrifices on this day? Oh, somebody wrote in the thing. Right, exactly, right. The way the text, right, the narrator, as it were, the Torah text, as Randy put in the chat, right, is keeps saying the remaining sons. And Moshe seems to be saying like, oh, like, well, you guys are the Kohanim. I'm just going to continue as normal with the Kohanim. But the text is saying like, every time you call them the remaining sons, it's like, well, why are they the remaining sons? Because the other two just died. So there seems to be, I think, something kind of lurking above a lot of these sections that is not fully acknowledged by the characters in it, or at least by Moshe. I don't know if that's expanding too much on what you said, but I think that that's right. Why do we think that the thing that Aharon finally says is, how could I eat the sin offering today? Would that really please God? Question mark. So I think, right, I'm inclined, part of me wants to say, oh, well, actually, part of what's happening here is a little displacement, which I think those of us who live halachically through emotional times may relate to, where, right, like, they can't argue about, Aaron never says, this wasn't fair, right? He never argues with Moshe when Moshe says, oh, this means that God loves your sons. They don't, there's nothing at least attributed to Aaron saying about the actual tragedy itself. The sort of the emotions here are mediated through a dispute about something allegedly neutral, like halacha, right? Like, what's the right thing to do here? I think we have this in our world a lot, where people, it sounds like they're arguing about halacha, but really they're arguing about something else. That's like one of the things they teach you in rabbi school, which I have not attended, but that's what I hear. You know, like a lot of times you'll get this question. It's like, oh, so like, is it okay for me to, like, you know, use a paper cup for Kiddush? That's like a question. And then it turns out like, well, because like my parents kicked me out of the house and all I have is a paper cup, and like, what should I do? Right? So like the question is, it's mediated through this halachic language, but it's not really what's happening. This feels a little like that to me, of like, you really want me, like, this is really what you're picking on me now for Moshe. Like, you really think God wants me to like worry about this korban now? This actually also is a source of halacha that it seems like in the Torah that the status of what we nowadays call an onain, which is, you know, a person who's between the death of their relative and the burial, more or less, that status seems very much related to eating kodshim, like eating ritual foods, that it's sort of like these, maybe proximity to death and proximity to the temple sort of don't mix. And this is one of the sources for that. And I think I personally suspect that's related to what you have in the Tannaitic literature also about Onanim as not supposed to say Shema or pray or wear tefillin, right? You're sort of disconnected from the holy. But right, that's sort of, on the one hand, that's a technical thing, but it's also a thing about, what was I about to say? Right, that's a technical halachic thing, but it also is a claim about what Aaron's feelings, right, in some way, about, right, that what Aaron is going through now is not fully compatible with his status as priest who doesn't leave the temple. And he's in a strange position because of his public position, he has to stay in the temple anyway, even though it doesn't really work. So maybe he's not going to eat the sacrifice, but he's also not allowed to fully mourn. Okay, so I want to make one more point, which is at the very end of the story, we start with Moshe kind of like a little explaining something to Aaron that maybe Aaron didn't ask for an explanation for, and we'll see some commentators sort of like responding to the lack of a back and forth in that first exchange where Aaron is silent, by inserting more. And in the end, it's Aaron who kind of has the last word, and Moshe hears and approves. But he doesn't say anything, right? And it feels like he finally kind of gets the message that like, just like leave us alone for a bit. Stop telling us things. And, we'll pick up soon, but not right now. So I wanted to explore some of the Midrashim and commentators specifically on the phrase, Vayidom Aharon, Aaron was silent, which I think, right, there's a bit of a form follows content situation in some ways, I think, where people are uncomfortable with that being, that's it, right? He just doesn't say anything, or he doesn't say anything because he's so upset, or because he's shell-shocked, or because he doesn't know what to do. He's being quiet, maybe because he's so holy, right? He's being quiet because he's transcended this deeply emotional moment. So we'll see a little bit. So here's a Midrash Aggadah. This is how it appears on Merkavah, which is a wonderful website. They don't tell you exactly what it is, but I don't know. So here it is. Vayomer Moshe Aaron, right? Moshe says to Aaron, this is what God has said, I will be sanctified with those who are close to me, which is like, okay, Vayidom Aharon, Aaron was silent. Kivan Shera'a Moshe et Aharon omed v'toheh. Moshe saw Aaron standing there and being sort of in distress. And I translated in shock. I don't know, maybe in distress. Omer oili shekach rabbi adi b'yad banai. He was saying like, woe to me that there's some sin among, like, in my hands or my children's hands, right? Sort of. I mean, you could read it in a few ways. You could read it as, again, trying to paper over the feelings and turn them into something halachic. But I think there's also something here where his children, it seems, died because they did something wrong. And he's saying, like, how did I raise a kid like this? And how did everything just fall apart? Right? So so Moshe comes to console him. Amarlo, achi, Zemi Sinai Amarle. He said, my brother, actually, this was told to me at Sinai. Sha'atida kadosh baruch hu lekadesha tabayit. God would sanctify this house with a great person. And I thought, Hayiti Omer Obi Ovacha. This appears in Rashi later, we'll see, right? It would be either me or you. And it seems like everybody's assuming that to sanctify means to kill, which is kind of distressing. I thought it would be one of us. The fact that God has killed your son doesn't mean that they're sinners and you should feel guilty. It means that they were so holy that they sort of like they couldn't stay away almost, right? When Aaron heard that, then he was quiet. And that's why it says Vayidom Aharon. So how has this reframed the Aaron's silence? I'm practicing extended pregnant pauses because of the topic of the class. How does it work with the strange fire? Good question, right? It seems like they did something wrong. How can it be that they're so holy? I think it could be that they did something wrong, but also maybe they had good intentions, that they were so moved by the earlier spiritual experience. We'd have to look at probably at the Midrashim or at Rashi and the earlier Psukim to fully understand what they're doing. Maybe they have a good faith dispute with their teacher, Moshe. That's one of the ways that it's phrased. I think most traditionally they did something wrong, right? But I guess, there's different kinds of wrong and different kinds of people who can do wrong, I guess is what this Midrash would say, right? Everybody sins sometimes, and these people sort of had, they were in general on a very high level, right? So much so, you could say, right, one way of thinking about it is so much so that when they do a little thing wrong, they get a big punishment. One thing that is not so much on the source sheet, but I think is lurking also, is when Moshe says, oh, that's what God said, Bikrovai Akadesh. Well, where did God say that? You will not find those words previously in the Torah. So Rashi and some other Mefarshim try and find like what pasuk really means this thing. But others, I think Ramban actually says like, no, it doesn't mean that God actually said this anywhere. This was God's idea. And Moshe is sort of privy to God's idea, but that's also, I think, a little pregnant in this situation. Now that I said pregnant pause, I'm going to keep saying pregnant, sorry. Right, that's also like a little bit suggestive in the situation where Moshe is the one who's verbalizing things that maybe were not verbalized before and maybe should not be verbalized. And Aaron is the one who's not. I'm just going to look in the chat. Jennifer says, silence and fire have silence in common, but they're very opposite. Right. Yeah, I think that they're not really, right, it doesn't seem like they're either opposites or the same. They're just kind of like, yeah, both are, well, fire actually does make noise, but yeah, in some ways they both leave like an empty space right afterwards. But yeah, I think Aaron's reaction is sort of, in some ways it's more in keeping with the nature of something just being like zapped to nothingness, but it's not quite this. Yeah, I agree. It's not fully the same. Right. So the idea that like what this midrash and what the Ramban also suggests without that midrash, right? Aaron was silent. He was crying and then he was quiet. Right. That Vayidom Aharon is not Aaron's full reaction. That there's a part of the story that's left out, which is responsive, I think, to what we saw in the text. I would just sort of jumps in and is like, Moshe just says this thing. Well, what did Aaron do? Like, he's the dad. What happened? So, right. This frames it as Vayidom Aharon. Aharon was quiet after Moshe consoled him, let's say. Which raises all like, how is this really a consolation? And is this really what's going on here? And it doesn't totally feel that way that Aaron, it seems actually like Moshe is pushing hard on the don't mourn, not necessarily because like, oh, I'm going to convince you why you don't have to, but for some other reason, like you really, it's not your status and you can't even though you want to, which is a little different than like, oh, Aharon has totally come around and completely agrees. But that's sort of one take, is that they sort of insert into the story that Aharon wasn't always silent. He was reacting normally, right? Naturally, crying, upset, and then they kind of, Moshe turned him. And in that sense, the silence is some kind of acceptance, right? Like, okay, I feel better, or some better in some way. Chizkuni is from the sort of same Beit Midrash as Rashi a little bit later, I believe. He says Aaron was silent from his desire to mourn, right? Which I think is more the way many of us understood it, Pshat, which is, right, Aaron never actually engaged in the crying, mourning practices. He desisted the whole time. It's interesting that it appears after Moshe's statement, but that he had been doing this the whole time. What is the difference between shatak and yidom is a great question, right? An interesting, it's a very interesting question. Vayidom, I don't know that I want to pretend to be actually expert on this, but I will say that, right, Vayidom, first of all, it appears several times having to do with mourning, or becoming, yeah, it appears in a few contexts having to do with mourning, especially poetic contexts. But it's not, right, it feels like it should carry more. In some ways, I think that's one of the issues with the Ramban or the Midrash that we saw, is that like shatak doesn't mean like I was making noise and then or shatak would mean that. I was making noise and then I stopped. Vayidon feels to me, I don't know, somebody who's a biblical philologist can argue with me, but it feels like it's a little bit more holistic, right? Right. It's not that he was stopped making noise. It's that he had his whole demeanor was dome, right? Quiet, silence.
Is kind
I
of
like that. Yeah, no, I think that's nice. Yeah, let's go with that.
Quieted.
Right. Quieted in the sense of
His
not just like
spirit was
shh,
quiet.
but
No,
right.
his spirit was quieted.
Huh, is the grammar passive tense like that?
I don't
Or-
think so. But I think you could say he quieted himself, might capture that, right? As opposed to, I don't think it's passive, but meaning, I think
I don't know.
I think the sense is, I think the suggestion is not about who quieted him, but more about the idea that like when you think about, sometimes, maybe this depends on the person, but quiet could be just like shush, no talking, but quieted is a more holistic sort of suggestion about your way of being. I don't know if that was what you meant. Yeah, but okay. All right. So here we have, I think, so basically, like, I think that it's not so much the pshat to say that, like, well, Aaron was making noise and then he was quiet. And part of it is because it doesn't say shatak. But so, right, if we return back to the more pshat, which is that Aaron sort of desisted from the natural inclination to mourn in a sort of noisy, either emotionally noisy or physically noisy way. Why? So Rabag suggests, Rabag I feel like is not highly, the sort of like medieval rationalist, not always like the most psychological. So I guess that's what I'll say. I was not surprised to see this. But you don't know Haron, shatak. First of all, he says, oh, it just means he was quiet. Lo tza'aku v'cha, right? He didn't cry out, right? He didn't cry out like most people would. Because he was such a high status person, it was not appropriate for him to behave that way. Which I think it's very interesting that what's absent here is like, and he didn't have those feelings. It sounds to me in Ralbag very much like he did have those feelings, but he just couldn't express them because that's not what you're allowed to do. My little daughter was just listening to this like ridiculous parody book about, it's called like Princess Red Riding Hood's Guide to Royalty or something, whatever. Part of the Land of Stories series for those who have 9-year-olds in your life. And one of the things about the queen is like, you should never let people know that you're upset. If you're getting, it's like written as a parody, right? If you're getting upset with the situation, you just say, I'm sorry, I just remembered I have important castle business to attend to, and you leave the room, right? But that's what this feels like to me. Like Aharon is just like, he may have all the inner turmoil, but his stature demands that he not display it publicly. Jennifer.
Hey, thank you. For all of this and for everyone's comments. I just wondered, I'm picturing, God forbid, one of those tragic situations where in an instant, for whatever reason, your whole world is shattered and you see before you, it's almost as if you're just stunned into silence. You're not even at a moment of, haven't even arrived at grief. You're paralyzed in a way that a revelation of good, it makes you effervesce, like, oh, can you believe that? Oh, I wish I could be like that. And thank you. Whereas this kind of thing, you're in shock, basically.
Right. I think that I also am, my tendency is to read the story that way. I think it's worth noting that the traditional commentators don't like that. They're not drawn, let's say differently, they're not drawn to that reading. And it's an interesting question as to why, right? Maybe it's because that feels like a failure. I don't know. I think at the end, maybe I'll return to that thought, because whether or not they want to attribute that to Aharon, it is definitely a thing. At the end, we'll bring it to hopefully some of like actual mourning practices / hilkhot / statements about ordinary mourning. As you're saying that, yeah, like, if you've ever been to a particularly brutal shiva, right, where there's really nothing to say, yeah, that's sort of how it does
Yeah.
feel that way. And it seems like the commentators they're almost choosing not to go in that direction so far. But we
Can
will
I,
maybe see
oh,
that. Yeah.
can I just ask one, then I'll be completely quiet.
Sure.
Is
Okay.
it assumed that Aaron's silence followed immediately upon seeing his sons burnt away, or was there time elapsed? And did they purposely not choose to include the reaction of the crowd who watched it as well?
So that's very interesting, right? That like there seems to be a lot missing in that story. I don't know how much time it is, right? The Rashi sort of says that there was stuff that happened that then Moshe intervened, right? What happened to the people outside? They've kind of faded in an interesting way. And one of the actually, I mean, is a broader Sefer Vayikra point. One of the consequences of this event is going to be that future encounters, direct encounters with the divine and the Kodesh Kodeshim are going to be limited to the Kohen Gadol and not these like mass events that could inspire inappropriate reactions. Yeah.
I think in the passage that was on the previous screen, Moshe might be intimating to Aaron that God took his sons home, but not that it wasn't a punishment or a disciplinarian reaction, but rather God took them, and that living in this world on Kador Aretz isn't the end, and that there was some holy acceptance, which is a really turning it inside out of their fire pans, of their sacrifice. And that it seems to me that Aaron's response to him came when Moshe said, God, your sons are taken home to heaven.
Right.
And then Aaron went, oh, okay then.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting, right? And in terms of reading it as not just Krovai, they were close to you, and that's why this happened to you. They got an extra punishment, right? But that like they're still close to you, like they were brought closer almost through this event. And there are certainly some, I think, like last few hundred years commentators, I forget where I saw that looking at this today, that sort of says basically that, right? Their soul was so like on the edge of their body, it was so close to God that it just like, popped out in an instant. Yeah, I think that is probably behind that it's supposed to be comfort, right? Not just that your children were on a high level, you don't feel guilty. That's nice, right? But that like what's happened to them is actually in some ways good, right? They've been part of, right? They've sanctified the mikdash, and maybe they themselves have been sanctified. Yeah, okay. All right, so let's look at Abarbanel. Abarbanel, I think, goes to, and Abarbanel is already, I believe, like 15th century. He goes to this more psychological reading that Jennifer was suggesting, right? He cites the Ramban, who says Aaron was crying and then Moshe kind of comforted him. And he says the explanation of Aaron was silent as his heart was turned. What does he say? Aval perush vayidom Aharon, the underline. That's where I started translating. His heart was turned v'haya ke'evan domem. It was like an inanimate stone. Right, he didn't even start crying like an ordinary father mourning. Right, he neither had an intense expression of grief, nor was he comforted by what Moshe said. His silence is not an indication that he's okay. It's this to me feels like it's an indication that he's neither okay nor not okay. He's just like almost not there, right? Right, he basically had nothing left. He was just like emptied. He had nothing to say. Right, which is again picking up. It's not that, no, it doesn't say vayishtok, right? He was quiet. It's something about his whole essence, right? He's just like has nothing. He has nothing to offer in this moment. In which case, there Moshe feels a little like, right, in both exchanges between Moshe and Aaron, Moshe first tries to give an explanation which leaves Aaron still kind of empty. And at the end, Moshe's like, why didn't you eat the thing? And Aaron sort of gets the last word. In which case, like this passage might be sort of validating Aaron's process, whatever it is, over the overly legalistic one. Should I do this? Maybe we'll come back to Avot Rabbi Natan if there's time. So I really like this story, and it happens to quote well, I'll just say, right, that this passage in Avot Rabbi Natan, which maybe we'll read together at the end, It's not really about silence, but it's really good. So I hope you'll forgive me. But it suggests that Aaron did accept Tanchumin. Actually, you know what? Let's read it. Let's do it. Why not? This is an abbreviated version of this story. So some people may know that in Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who's sort of like the primary sage of the sort of the moment of the temple's destruction, who kind of, closes that generation, starts a new generation, founds the academy at Yavne. He has 5 primary students, and the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot talks about like who's good, who's bad, all these things, and like the one, probably Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, is kind of like the best in most of the readings. Okay, so Avot Rabbi Natan, which is a post-Mishnaic. Exactly how post-Mishnaic, I don't know, but it's a post-Mishnaic composition that functions kind of like a commentary on Pirkei Avot, expands on that. Pirkei Avot has these short little things, right? Each of them gets a nickname, each of them has a little saying. Here it's like a very extended story about the same 5 students, and it begins with a moment where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's son dies, and his students come to console him. And the first one enters Rabbi Eliezer, and he says, "Rabbi, can I say something?" He says, "Yes." They follow the same pattern. He says, "Well, Adam Harishon had a son who died, and he accepted consolation." Who's that son who died, by the way? Cain. Right. So it's already a little bit sanitized, because it's not just he had a son who died, he had one son who killed the other son, but okay. Right. How do we know he accepted consolation? Because it said, Adam again knew his wife for the birth of Seth. So, right, Adam sort of like went back to his normal life. And it seems like Rabbi Eliezer, right, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, from the continuation of the story, it seems like it's been a while since his son died, and he's sort of not moving on. So they're all trying to convince him to move on, but being like, look, all these biblical characters move on. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, like, well, that's actually not helping me, right? It's not enough that I'm troubled for myself, but you have to remind me of the pain of Adam, right? And everybody's going to come and give him like right? Like, well, this biblical character moved on, you should too. And he's like, why are you just reminding me of all the death and destruction in the world? So Rabbi Yeshua comes and says, oh, Job had sons and daughters who died. And he's like, why are you making my life worse? The reason I brought this here, the connection is Rabbi Yossi came and said, can I say something? The same pattern. Can I say something? Sure, say something. And here also, right, they're sort of in a pattern which some of us also, maybe people who have sat Shiva had this, right? The visitor who kind of like, the roles are reversed where you end up kind of like helping them emotionally as opposed to the opposite, right? Where they're like, oh, can I say something? It's like, okay, I guess you can say something. So he said, oh, Aaron had 2 adult sons and they both died. And he accepted consolation. Well, where did we see Aaron accept consolation, right? Vayidom Aharon, right? Maybe similar to sort of the Rashi or the Midrash reading, right? That like, Moshe said, don't worry, it was okay. And I was like, okay, I guess it's okay. And he moved on. And then Shimon tries the same thing. And then Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, he's the outlier. He comes and he does something very different, which is he says, first, well, whatever, there's a lot to say. But at the very end, he says, what's it like, right? A person who the king entrusted a package, and every day he would say, like, like, this is such a burden. I don't want to have this burden. Get this out of my house. Like, I just want you to pick it up already. I don't want to be responsible for your expensive stuff in my house. I don't have an alarm system, whatever it is. So you, Rabbi, right, you were entrusted with a package, being your child. You took care of it. You taught him Torah. And when you returned it intact, and, you should accept consolation, which, like, whenever I teach this, I would not recommend trying this if, God forbid, you go to a shiva for a child. But like, there's something about the way, I think there is a psychological insight here, which is that piling more problems onto people does not help them, right? Like, oh yeah, my mom also had cancer. Okay. Like, whereas sort of helping them reframe in some way, maybe not exactly this way, but a reframe is what true nechama is. And I don't, right. So it depends how you read what Moshe says, right? If what Moshe says consoles Aharon, you could read it as just kind of a reframe. You think, and I think the Midrash, right? You think that this means your sons were evil. Really, this means actually a good thing has happened to your sons. Anyway, so, and I think, right, in some ways, I do feel like also there's a little form follows content here, which is, right, sort of trying to browbeat somebody into accepting consolation, because you could prove from a pasuk that Aharon accepted consolation. Feels a little to me, to some degree, like what that reading is doing to the text, which is saying, like, Aaron, like, oh, really? Aaron is not like having an emotional meltdown. He's fine. He's a tzaddik and he's accepting it and it's all good. So maybe that's sort of why I put that there. And I don't know, another time, maybe we will revisit that story.
It was a great story.
It is a good story. There's more,
Thank
but
you.
I think it's a great story. And I actually wrote about it once. Maybe should I find it on the internet? I wrote about it on the Lair House, if you ever read that website, about like, what things to say and not to say. And there's a lot of water imagery in that. It's a very interesting story. But anyway.
Interesting. Oh, thanks.
So yeah. Okay, so here we have, it's a little cheating to put Rashi near the end of the source sheet, but I did, sorry. Because everybody else knows Rashi, but that's okay. I mean, everyone we've already read except for the Midrash knows Rashi, but here we are. So this is what the Lord has spoke, right? He asked this question that I mentioned before. Where did God even say this? Oh, when it says, that it will be, right? The words, what Moshe says in Vayikra is Hashem has said, "Bikrovai akadesh ve'al panei kol ha'am akabed." Among those who are close to me, I will be akadesh, I will be sanctified, and I will be kavod, I will be glorified on the face of all the people. So Rashi finds another pasuk that uses those same two roots, kadosh and kavod, to be like, oh, this is what he's really referring to. Okay, that's based on a Gemara. Fine. Amar lo Moshe Aharon. Here, Moshe said to Aharon, Aaron, my brother, right? The same thing. I knew that it would be one of us, and I didn't know which one. And now I see that your sons are greater than me. But I just wanted to know, what does Rashi not have that the Midrash we saw has? Right? Rashi does not have Aharon crying in advance. Rashi doesn't have Moshe saw that Aaron was upset, told him this, and then he was quiet. Right? In some ways, right, it's left open. Maybe Aaron was upset, or maybe Aaron was already either stoic or numb or accepting in some way, and Moshe lets him in on the secret anyway, right? And then, Vayidom Aharon, B'kibel sachar al shtikato. He received a reward for his silence, right? This definitely sees Aaron's silence as sort of an act of self-control, right? An act of overcoming your normal inclination, not necessarily because people are watching you like a Barbanel, but because, right, there's something about the situation that requires it. Masachar kibel, what reward did he receive? That the God's speech was spoken to him alone. I don't know how to translate nitached exactly. Right, as it says, to him alone, Parshat Shtuyei Yain, which if we go back up at the top, I highlighted this, but we kind of didn't really notice it, or maybe I pretended not to notice it at first. Maybe some of you did, and right. Vaydaber Hashem el Aharon lemor. The Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Don't drink wine or other intoxicants." That's I believe the only place that appears in the Chumash. Usually it's God spoke to Moses saying, God spoke to Moses and Aaron saying. God spoke to Aaron saying is only here. Which is interesting, right? I think that there's sort of a little tit for tat morality tale version, or like a sort of the simple reading of Rashi that makes my kids think Rashi is dumb, which is, I shouldn't say that, but it happens sometimes to children that they think Rashi is not interesting, but Rashi is very interesting, right? The simple version is like, oh, well, we have these two like anomalies. We have this weird thing about Vayidom Aharon, and then we have this place where it's only speaking to Aaron. So like one is a response to the other, and like, it's just a reward. But if we sort of push on it, right? What's the reward? The reward for Aaron's silence is that he receives divine message. Now, like what message he receives is a good question, right? That he receives a message of like, don't get drunk. I don't know how one would frame that, right? Maybe he receives a message sort of promoting clarity, promoting sort of clarity of all your faculties in encountering God. Let's say maybe we want to frame it that way. So Aharon, through his silence, through his sort of desisting from the ordinary acting out of emotions that take up a lot of space, or maybe even sort of quelling his inner emotions, right? He is able to receive a divine message. And that I think is actually very suggestive. No, you can disagree, but it seems to me very suggestive to say that Aaron, because he's able to quiet himself in this moment because, right, not just because he's in this position and people are looking at him, but because the moment itself, it's not just that his sons just died. He also just saw the presence of God. He also actually just brought the presence of God into the people. And he's kind of, he has to be able to live for more than his own thing right now. He is also a representative of people, and he has to be able to take that perspective in, right? It's not, he doesn't go straight back to being the Kohen Gadol and just be like, oh, tunnel vision, like I'm the Kohen, nothing that matters happened, right? That's it. That's not what he does, right? He also doesn't fully go back to being the Kohen Gadol. He doesn't eat the sacrifice that Moshe thinks he should have ate, right? He's eaten. He doesn't sort of ignore his tragedy, but he also doesn't fully lean into it and pretend that other things are happening, right? He's in this sort of contradictory situation where on the one hand, right, he's part of this big theophany, I think is a fancy word for it, right? This divine revelation to all the people. And on the other hand, he has this personal tragedy, which is actually connected to the divine revelation. And he, rather than sort of claim that he has all the answers, desists. Both he doesn't speak, right? And he doesn't eat the sacrifice. Like he's going to desist a little. And in some ways that's that's related to I think the halachic status of onain, which is you're stepping back from the ordinary world, right? You're not involved in mitzvot. You're sort of too close to death to really be involved, but he's also too close to holiness to fully detach. So I think this idea of Aaron receiving a reward, and the reward that he receives as a divine message, is very suggestive, right? That his ability to hold that space, you could say, is akin to prophecy. And that's what this Torah Hamor here says. Also a person who maybe I'll Google this person right now, or somebody can tell me who they are.
Can I ask something? Yeah, the idea that, one interpretation with Aaron's sons is they just got carried away. They were intoxicated with the moment, and so the idea that Hashem, of all the things he could have given Aaron the responsibility to do, it's sort of like parents who, God forbid, lose a child, and then they make it their mission to have no parent ever have to experience the loss of a child due to whatever. And so the idea that now Aaron will be in a position to deal with the people who may become intoxicated, and then of course later, is it earlier or later? Forgive me, the golden calf, where the people literally become dancing around, sort of intoxicated, and it's a big problem. So
right, that is earlier, but yeah, I mean, he's sort of right. He's put that the message is not just a message of sort of clarity, but it's a message of avoiding excess of this kind, right?
Yes, and he gets to be the one who suffered. So when his sons may have given way to this, and it cost them their lives.
No, I like that, right? It's not just that his ability to hold space can make space for the divine message, but that his particular experience makes space for this particular divine message. Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's a clue here about what happens historically, that sometimes, at least, the Kohen HaGadol died when he was in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, and they had to drag him out with the rope. So I think there's a hint of that here, that maybe when these how do you say it, connections are made between the priest and God, that sometimes people can't maintain their earthliness. Their soul is merged because God is so powerful. And I just like to hear your reflection on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting in that maybe it's offering sort of two paths to that. I do think that the sort of the traditions about the Kohen Gadol dying in Yom Kippur tend to be framed as Kohanim who are not worthy, right? It's not the super holy Kohanim who die, it's the ones who aren't worthy, who have the position for a bad reason and sort of don't treat it appropriately. But maybe this is offering an alternative for Aharon, which is, right, like sort of to purify or clarify yourself so that you can exist in the divine presence without dying. Let's say, right, and maybe your sons were at a higher level such that it was no longer possible for them to hold that slight distance. That's possible. Yeah, so I just looked up actually who's the Tzvara Tzvara is Avraham Saba from Venice in the 15th century. So a little bit of Zohar vibe. So I just wanted, he sort of picks up on this prophecy question, right? As opposed to just like, this is a reward that he got this alone as sort of like a credit thing, which I think how it's often presented in Rashi, that it's more than credit. It's like, he actually had this religious experience, right? I'll read the English, which I wrote here also. It tells us the high level of Aaron and his sons, that even though it's known that prophecy doesn't vest on one who is sad, right? And we see this in, for example, Sefer Shmuel, right? Like Shaul loses his ruach, right? His sort of like divine inspiration when he's sad, and that's why he wants David to play the harp, right? So that's true. But the word was designated for him, dibur. Probably word is like a bad translation there, but the dibur, divine speech, right? Because his will was in agreement with the will of creation. He justified the judgment, hayamatzdik et hadin b'simcha, which seems like an almost like inhuman reaction, that Aaron was just like, whatever you want, God. Other commentators connect this to like an Akeda moment, whatever you want, God. Right? Take my sons, whatever you want, must be right. Right. And because he's able to do that, he's not even sad. And that's why he's able to have prophecy. And furthermore, but he actually is kind of sad, so the prophecy is cheering him up. And it told him not to drink wine. This is, I think, a very interesting observation. It told him not to drink wine because that's the opposite of those who are in mourning. You give them wine to comfort them, which fits actually in the psukim, right? The immediate previous passages, don't let your hair grow, don't rend your garments, don't leave the temple because you're the priest. And then the next thing is, and don't drink wine. So he's kind of reading those two things connected, which is another thing you would do if you were fully mourning would be to dull your senses, right? To sort of like not sort of like remove yourself a little bit from the situation in some way, but don't do that. And don't do that because almost you don't have to, right? Because you sort of see more clearly than ordinary humans, which I think, it's difficult for me to, I think that there's a tendency in traditional type commentators to be like, yeah, like a holy person like Aaron, obviously he wouldn't have been upset when somebody dies. He knows that God has God's reasons and it's all good, right? And I think that tendency I don't love in this kind of story, but I do think there's something here about, right, like Aaron does seem to be in a place where on the one hand, maybe you could read his silence as like total shock and disengagement and removal, but also as something a little more productive, as being able to hold space and being able to sort of to not have the whole world fall apart because of this, but not to rush in with some words that aren't appropriate, to sort of see, to step back and hold something a little bit in abeyance. As I promised, I just did want to close with two, this is not the proof text for this Gemara, but still, with two passages from the Gemara. Maybe I'll start with the last one first. 11 is in Brachot. Rav Papa, Amar Rav Papa, Agra. So there's a whole series of these little like sayings on this page in Brachot, like the reward of X is Y. For example, like the reward of Masorah, Torah is Masorah, I think it says. The reward of Beit Hamya, the reward for attending a house of mourning, why they call it that, I don't know, is shikuta, is silence. I think reward doesn't really, reward means sort of like that, here it means sort of like the apex. The best expression of going to a house of mourning is silence, right? That like mourning means that there's not necessarily something to say. And in fact, there is a halacha, which is usually observed in the breach, but not in so I'm from Boston, in the Toner community in Boston, and now I guess in New York, they really do observe this halacha, and people don't speak until spoken to in a shiva, which means if you're not spoken to, it's just quiet. So Rabbi Yochanan said, "Ein min achamin risha'in lomar davar ad she'yiftecha avel." Right, the consolers are not allowed to say anything until the mourner opens, which also explains part of the story we saw. Where can I say something? Where they're kind of like trying to observe this halacha, but they can't. They can't prevent themselves from saying, "Can I say something?" Which sounds like even that would be too much. But that's why they ask for permission, maybe because they're not really supposed to say. Most people don't know or observe this halacha, but I think it's interesting to imagine what shiva would be like if everybody did. Right? So you don't say anything, you just sort of walk in quietly until the mourner says something. And there's a proof text from Eov, which is once Eov spoke, then Eliphaz responded to him. So I guess I just I always end with, I wanted to close with that. I think that the Aharon's silence is very fruitful as a story, as part of that narrative, as part of both how the commentators do or don't see natural human reactions to death and suffering there for him. Is it praiseworthy that he's not crying? Is it only because of his status? Is it because he has some bigger picture bird's eye view? Is it because he doesn't even really believe that what's happened to him is bad? Is it because he's so numb, right? Like you can see all of those in different commentators, and the connection to his then receiving a prophecy about alcohol, I think, is also very interesting. But that this question of death as sort of a rupture that we don't have words to address, I think comes out also in these hilkhot. And that sometimes trying to address death with words at the wrong time is wrong, right? I think this connects also for those who were here to what we saw in Rabbi Nachman at the beginning, right? There are certain kinds of questions that we don't have answers for words. We only have, silence is the only answer. Silence allows you to sort of like enter the halal hapnai into that language for those who were here. Right. So like, yeah, could be Aaron Shah. I think that there's I think that whatever, even if the message of Aaron is he was on this level that none of us have approached, or he's sort of
Ms. Gedwiser.
No, I think it's only Miriam.
She's
Okay.
frozen.
so thank
All
you
right.
for joining me on this journey.
Oh,
And I hope to learn.
Thank
with
Ms.
you.
you.
We
Gedwiser, you
lost
were
you.
just frozen for like 30 seconds there. Do you want to just repeat your last point? Because
My last point, I don't even remember. What I was trying to say is, I think that this idea of sometimes silence being the proper response to death, or the only response to death, or the non-response to death, is, first of all, it's related to the Rabbi Nachman we saw, where God tells Moshe to be quiet when he asks about the unfair death of Rabbi Akiva, that you can't answer that with words, you can only answer it with silence. But also, even if that is not always our own natural inclination or even ability, to look at our own laws of avelut, right, as the passage has just showed, but also our laws of aninut and sort of pulling back from ritual or religious engagement as encouraging us, or sort of leading us in that direction of a time for saying less. And maybe that's sort of part of that experience, whether or not it actually works out that way. As visitors, maybe we could be aware of that going forward, or thinking about it. So thanks all.
thank you. This was wonderful. You're a wonderful teacher, and it was very rich and articulate and analytical.
Thank you
Great
so much.
class.
And
Thank
thank you,
you.
yeah,
Thank you for
Yael,
coming.
and for your
Like I said, I hope
comments
to learn again. Yeah.
and all the resources
comments.
you brought. So thank you.
Great class.
thank you
Thanks
so much,
much.
Ms. Gedwiser. Thank you to everyone who joined us here on Zoom and on Facebook Live. Yeah, thank you for this wonderful series. I really hope we get to learn with you again soon. And to all of our learners, I want to just tell you quickly, we've got this week's conversations on the Parsha. We'll have Rabbanit Leah Sarna and Dr. Ethan Schwartz, which is really exciting. And we've got lots of other upcoming classes. So please check them out at yeshiva.org, and we're really excited to learn with you again soon. Thank you so much, and have a great week.
Okay, thanks all.